In 1987, the Toronto, Ontario suburb of Scarborough is under attack. A serial rapist is preying on teenage girls.
Women, when they were riding the bus home late at night, at the time, the bus driver would only stop at the bus stop. It was very easy to see who was on the bus, whether male or female, and you could position yourself that you could see that the bus was slowing down, so he could just run down the street, hide behind some houses, and just follow her. And, you know, if she went a long distance or down a dark street, he attacked her.
In just 4 weeks, 2 girls are brutally raped and tortured.
In addition to the sexual assault itself, it was a physical trauma associated with the sexual assault. He was profane toward the victims. He used degrading and demeaning terms such as bitch, whore, slut, that type of thing. In some instances, he even forced the victims to degrade themselves.
The Metropolitan Toronto Police have little to go on. None of the victims have seen their attacker's face.
He told me that if I didn't stop screaming.
Toronto police set up surveillance in the area and double their patrols.
What's she saying? What is she saying?
Copy. It's not him.
When details of the rapes are published, the town is gripped with fear.
They were warning the public about it, and everybody was quite aware in the Toronto area about this Scarborough rape so that they could, protect themselves from it.
Police set up a hotline.
Good morning, Scarborough Assault Task Force.
And hundreds of tips pour in, but there are no solid leads.
Scarborough was such kind of an upper-class, stable upper-class neighborhood. No one thought anyone there would be capable of such horrific crimes.
It was a real concern, and there was a huge task force assigned to it, and the police held like town hall meetings.
And they were warning women about that there seemed to be a predator in the area.
"23-year-old Paul Bernardo is a junior accountant living in Scarborough.
He had a lot of charm. He knew how to sweet-talk people.
But Paul has a darker side.
Paul Bernardo is a psychopathic, narcissistic sexual sadist. It is not the infliction of pain that's arousing to the sexual sadist. It's the suffering of a victim. It can be either psychological suffering or physical suffering. Psychopathic, indicating he can change his personality to adapt to the environment he finds himself in. He's very manipulative, chronic liar, narcissistic. By that I mean he is very self-centered. He considers himself to be the center of the universe. Everyone exists for his pleasure.
He eludes police as he continues his assault on the young girls of Scarborough.
Paul Bernardo is fixated on virgin girls. And I think the reason for that is really very simple to explain. Paul Bernardo was very much into power. He enjoyed power. And part of the power that I think he enjoyed was his fantasy of deflowering them, taking away something that they possessed.
But he is not always successful. On July 27th, one girl resists his attack, but he brutally beats her before he runs off.
He had no guilt, no remorse, and no empathy, yet he could be very charming and a likable guy to be around, which masked all of these very, very deadly tendencies that were lurking beneath the surface.
Bernardo is a master at hiding his dark secret. To the outside world, he appears to be the all-Canadian boy. On October 17th, 1987, Paul Bernardo meets 17-year-old Karla Homolka.
She was coming to a convention in Scarborough, animal convention. She worked in a veterinarian shop, and Bernardo just happened to be there with a friend. And the two of them saw Karla and her friends there, and Paul, being the attractive charmer, just sort of moved right in. She is a very attractive person, nice figure, and she was totally enthralled with him and would do anything he wanted.
When a sexual sadist wants to develop a person who's willing to participate in the behaviors he desires, he goes through 5 specific steps. Step number 1 is to identify the vulnerable person.
He saw in her someone that he could control, and they eventually ended up in a hotel room. Had sex that night.
I think when this all started, when she started her relationship with Paul Bernardo, she was a small-town girl. She was 17 or 18, but she was no naif. But she was not savvy to the ways of the world. You know, the sex came first. They were in lust, not necessarily in love.
It was difficult to get a handle on her. I mean, on one hand, she was a very strong-willed person, and it was hard to understand why a person that was strong-willed and very intelligent, by the way, have a very high IQ, why a person like that would not see the danger.
Karla Homolka lives with her parents 90 minutes southeast of Toronto in the small town of St. Catharines by Niagara Falls.
He started seeing her, he started driving out to St. Catharines after that and staying with her, and while he was still living in Toronto. She had a very good family. The family was, everybody in the neighborhood liked going there. They had a swimming pool in the backyard. The father and mother were very sociable people.
To Karla, Paul is the perfect man.
He was a small-town girl who wanted to get the heck out of St. Catharines, and Paul Bernardo was the big Toronto boy, and it was almost, you know, he came into her life and kind of swooped her away, and she was in high school at the time, and he drove up in his big fancy car and impressed the hell out of everybody. Well, they're high school kids, and so she fell in for that.
It's not long before she falls under his spell.
Step number 2 is seduction. He uses the same techniques that you or I would use with the opposite sex to seduce them into a sexual relationship. He's attentive, he gives gifts, he's spontaneous. Over a period of time, the victim falls in love with him. Step number 3 is to reshape her sexual norms. He begins introducing sexual activities into their sexual play that she's never participated in before.
While Paul and Karla continue their relationship, the brutal attacks in Scarborough increase. By November of 1988, the rape count reaches 7.
He said it wasn't the same. Consensual sex just wasn't the same. It wasn't exciting, and it wasn't as satisfying as a rape was.
In the Toronto suburb of Scarborough, police track a serial rapist. The man they seek, Paul Bernardo, has eluded police for nearly a year.
He has a tremendous amount of anger toward women. Where did that anger emanate from? Was it his mother? Was it a babysitter? Was it a girlfriend? What? We don't know the answer to that.
He found out about age 15 or 16 that who he thought was his father wasn't his father, and somebody else was his father, and she'd be angry with him and always call him, "You bastard child." So this was a very volatile, tumultuous kind of environment that he was raised in.
A few months later, in Scarborough, Paul takes his 11th rape victim. Finally, investigators get a crucial lead.
One of the women was able to identify him. A composite sketch was done, and the likeness to Bernardo was absolutely incredible.
The sketch is released 2 days later.
Police did a huge media blitz. It was in all the papers. It was on billboards everywhere.
Investigators field thousands of tips. Over the next 6 months, they question 300 men, including Paul Bernardo.
Bank teller was suspicious when she saw him come to the bank, and she looked at the sketch. All his friends felt the same way, and they all teased him about it, and he just kind of laughed it off.
Scarborough police questioned Bernardo on November 20th.
Even though he looked bang on, he didn't look like your central casting villain, and the police interviewed him. They took a DNA sample. They were very suspicious, but they had other suspects.
He gave voluntarily up his sample for DNA. And as you know, that anybody that would refuse the DNA, then you might be a little more suspect of that man, whether he has reasons to or not. In this case, he volunteered it and gave it up without any kind of problems. So that, I think, caused maybe a little less alarm towards him.
Police release him and add Bernardo's sample to the 300 others and begin the slow testing process.
DNA testing at the time was not as sophisticated as it is today, not as quick.
Although the police now have hundreds of suspects, the investigation slows to a crawl.
It was a real concern. Then the attacks just mysteriously stopped. The task force dissolved, and Paul Bernardo just walked away.
That fall, Paul moves in with Karla and her family in St. Catharines. He admits to Karla that he was questioned by the police.
He could hint at it and see what her reaction would be. He could tell her that he is a rapist to see what her reaction would be. So he's holding that in reserve to be used at a later date.
A few months later, police in St. Catharines are called to investigate a rape. Paul's next victim is a 14-year-old girl, grabbed off the street in broad daylight.
He took greater risks not because he was not paying attention, but because he considered himself to be all-powerful. And the longer he was able to get away with his crimes, the more convinced he became that he was omnipotent.
After living with the Homolkas for several months, Paul sets his sights on Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy.
Tammy Lynn, Karla's younger sister, was very, this was the big city boy from Toronto, and Paul was very charming with her, and Paul eventually, because he liked sex with younger girls, liked to assault younger girls, told Karla that he wanted to have sex with her sister.
As to why Paul Bernardo would want Tammy, the younger sister of Karla, she represents virgin. She represents unspoiled youth. She's also a further test. How far is Karla willing to go to appease him, to please him?
He insists she help him rape Tammy.
Karla worked in an animal clinic, and she had access to drugs. She was the one who brought the drug home.
Karla chooses a combination of sedatives.
The plan was to spike her drink, and she would pass out, and Paul would have his way with her. He would videotape the whole thing, and then they'd put her back in bed. That's when she should have dumped him. She could have said to him, "What are you talking about? You want to rape my sister? Are you nuts? Like, what are you, a maniac?"
On December 23, 1990, Paul and Karla put their plan in motion.
They were all drinking that night, and the parents went to bed, and nobody had any reason to be suspicious.
Karla serves Tammy several alcoholic drinks laced with sleeping pills. She soaks a cloth with the anesthetic to be sure Tammy doesn't wake up.
Are you filming?
Yeah. Okay. Two lovely sisters.
In the Niagara Falls suburb of St. Catharines, serial rapist Paul Bernardo convinces his girlfriend, Karla Homolka, to drug her sister Tammy so he can rape her. The plan is carried out on December 23, 1990.
She had the chance to stop this whole thing. You know, and she should have just, and she didn't. She said, "Okay, let's go along with this plan."
They take turns raping Tammy. And then suddenly, she starts to choke.
And then the poor girl, when she started to come out of this, because she had drunk all this booze and mixed drinks and so forth, vomited and aspirated her stomach contents into her lungs.
Karla and Paul call 911.
And the investigating officers who attended at 911 treated it as just another teenager who had had too much to drink and had vomited and aspirated, and they didn't think much more about it.
Tammy dies at the hospital 3 hours later.
Paul kind of freaked out. He was crying. When the police came, he was emotionally upset. He was very disturbed. I don't think he wanted to see her die, but he put on a good show. And, you know, he didn't seem like a suspect.
Under the circumstances, there is no reason to suspect foul play. The medical examiner determines that Tammy choked on her own vomit after drinking too much alcohol. On December 27, 1990, Tammy Lynn Homolka is laid to rest. Paul blames Karla for her death.
Paul felt that because she worked in the animal clinic that she should have known better. She should have somehow controlled the quantity of drugs that they gave Tammy Lynn.
Eager to win back Paul's affections, Karla does whatever he asks to make up for her fatal mistake. She watches the video of Tammy's rape and dresses up in Tammy's clothing.
They had this awful secret that only they knew. They knew the truth to this, and that was a bond that kept them together.
Distraught over the death of their youngest daughter, the Homolkas ask Paul to move out so they can grieve in private. Paul continues with the next step of his plan. He takes Karla and they move to Port Dalhousie, 4.5 miles from St. Catharines.
Step number 4 is to socially isolate her. He doesn't want her talking to her friends and family members about what's going on.
In the winter of 1991, Paul and Karla start planning a large summer wedding.
She wanted her big wedding, even though her parents were still grieving the loss of her sister.
But their upcoming nuptials don't curb Paul's increasing sexual appetite.
He always talked about wanting to bring somebody home so that when he had sex with them, I should probably more accurately say that when he raped them over and over, he could do it at his leisure. And he told her that, and she said, she didn't object.
The motivation is affection and attention. She knows that as long as she is compliant, she's going to receive that attention and affection that is so important to her.
Paul was in Burlington, and he was just scouting out, perhaps looking for another victim, doing a little peeping Tomery. Leslie came home from a friend's funeral. She came home a little late. She knew her mother was going to be mad at her, so she sort of went into the backyard to get her courage up, I guess, before going in the house. And by complete fluke, there was Bernardo.
How's it going?
You got a cigarette?
I do, but it's in my car.
Well, can we go get it?
Yeah, let's go.
At 2 a.m. on June 15th, 1991, 15-year-old Leslie Mahaffey vanishes from her own backyard.
He brought her home and woke up Karla, and she said, "Oh, okay," and went back to bed.
Every sexual sadist that I have dealt with, face-to-face interviews, case consultations, practically every one of them had a fantasy of a long-term captive.
For the next 2 days, Leslie is brutally raped and terrorized. On June 29, 1991, 2 weeks after Leslie Mahaffey's abduction, the water line at nearby Lake Gibson recedes.
Hey, what happened was a fisherman had come out here to go fishing, and he tried to get further out into the water. And while he was doing that, he noticed some cement blocks, and he stepped on one of the blocks trying to get further out. And when he did, the top came off and exposed the body part. When we arrived here, we noticed that there were several similar-looking cement blocks there, and investigation obviously revealed that the rest of the body parts, with the exception of the torso, were in the other cement blocks. What happened next was that we received a call, again, fishermen at a bridge not too far away from this location had discovered a torso floating under the bridge. And that appeared to be the torso belonging to the limbs that were in Lake Gibson.
Right there.
Somebody went to great lengths for this body not to be recovered. And just, I guess, fortunately, they didn't do a very good job of it.
Niagara police do an intensive search of the crime scene, but find few clues.
What we did was check the residents in the area to see if they had seen any vehicles, or even better than that, maybe saw somebody dumping blocks into the water, and we didn't get anything there.
The remains are transported to the coroner's office for further analysis. That same afternoon, Paul and Karla marry in a lavish ceremony near Niagara Falls. After the reception, they whisk off to Hawaii for a 2-week honeymoon. In Niagara, police work on identifying their victim. They notify surrounding jurisdictions about the body parts found in Lake Gibson. Halton Regional Police were working a missing persons case.
Initially, we had what would be considered a standard missing person report for Leslie Mahaffey, who had gone missing from home. We had heard from Niagara Regional Police, who we work with on an ongoing basis, that they had found the body parts in Gibson Lake. That's when we were first sure.
The medical examiner determines that Leslie Mahaffey was strangled before being chopped up. Kent Laidlaw and 2 colleagues rush to notify the Mahaffey family before the story breaks in the media. But police can offer no answers for the grieving Mahaffey family.
It was really difficult because we didn't have a suspect, and we had minimal information.
Law enforcement across the region unite to find Leslie's killer.
When the investigation changes from a missing person to a homicide, I mean, it kicks up the level of commitment, the resources, the intensity, frankly. It changes it dramatically. It changed it dramatically in Burlington simply because we had so few homicides.
They turn to their only clue: the ready-mix brand of cement used to encase Leslie's remains. After checking numerous stores, police come up empty. A few weeks later, the newlyweds return from Hawaii.
They're getting a ride back from the airport. Karla's parents told her that they found a body in Lake Gibson. Paul was freaking, of course, but he presented an outward calm demeanor that her body had been found, but he was furious with Karla. And I'm not sure if that's when the beating started or the hitting started with her.
He blames Karla for not knowing about the receding water tables at Lake Gibson. Paul and Karla lay low for the next 9 months, waiting to hear if they are suspects in Leslie's murder.
When he realized that the investigation wasn't going anywhere, he wanted to do it again. This time he wanted to take Karla out with him, and he wanted to, there was a nearby school, there was a lot of students, and he would drive by and he would see the students and a lot of attractive young girls. He needed her to help him lure one of them into his car.
Paul knows younger victims are less likely to approach a male stranger, but they'll approach Karla. On April 16th, 1992, newlyweds Paul and Karla Bernardo stalked their next victim after kidnapping, raping, and killing a teenage girl in Canada. They happen upon 15-year-old Kristen French.
They parked in a church parking lot near the school where Kristen walked by every day, even though it was like 4 in the afternoon. And they parked the car in there, and then the plan was that Karla would put a map out and ask for directions and act like the klutzy dumb blonde. And she did that, and Kristen, who was a very cautious young girl, was totally duped by another woman, not believing another woman could be involved in any kind of a murder scheme.
When Kristen French doesn't return home from school, her parents immediately file a missing persons report.
Kristen was a very reliable person. She was never known to not come home or be a runoff or run away. So as soon as she never came home, it was late that night, they knew there was something wrong. Our attention was brought to that parking lot of that church very quickly, and there was some evidence left at the parking lot that led us to believe pretty quickly in investigation that this was more than a missing girl, that she was abducted.
The evidence is sent to the crime lab for analysis. Police canvass the area, looking for anyone who may have seen the abduction.
We started a hotline right away for anybody with any kind of tips.
If anybody's seen my daughter, Kristen French, I'd like to phone the Niagara police as quickly as possible.
We started looking at anybody with previous sexual violence in the background that we knew that were living in our area, investigating them.
Police efforts pay off when they learn that several people saw the kidnapping.
Witnesses had seen her pulled into a car. The witnesses could only describe them being as 2 people. They weren't able to identify their gender, so we assumed that they were probably 2 men.
And then we had a lead on a possible car seen leaving the church parking lot by some of the witnesses. So now we had a car, and it just escalated from there.
Paul and Karla hold Kristen captive in their home.
They forced her to do all kinds of degrading things. They tied her up in a closet at night. It's over a couple of day and a half or so. Several times, Paul went out for food, left Karla alone with Christian. Karla had more than enough opportunity, I believe it was twice, to let her go. She could have just picked up the phone, dialed 911. There would have been a dozen cruisers there within 30 seconds. But Karla did not do it.
The abduction sparks a media frenzy.
We want to know that we are thinking of you and that everything can be done is being done. And we'll get you back real quick.
I know the families believe it. I believe it that Kristen is out there alive.
Because of the way it was done, it was pretty brazen, in a church parking lot on a busy street in the middle of the afternoon, so it made everybody vulnerable. Everybody worried now that their kids could be the next girl abducted. And we didn't know if they were going to end up like Leslie Mahaffey in the way that she was murdered and put in the lake, so everybody was worried about that.
Members of Kristen's school create the Green Ribbon of Hope campaign, praying for her safe return.
We thought maybe that we could still recover her while she was alive. That was the hope and the desire of the task force.
On April 30th, 10 days after Kristen French disappears, a man stumbles upon her lifeless body in nearby Burlington.
Homicides were a very rare occurrence. To have two young people murdered in such a short period of time was highly unusual. There was a huge investment of manpower, of resources, but most of the officers that were engaged, if not all, really personalized it because of the age and the gender of the two young victims. We didn't know who was responsible. I actually had no idea at that point who was responsible. I would get phone calls at my office, moms or dads phoning and saying, "Can I let my daughter go to the library tonight? Is it safe?"
An autopsy reveals that, like Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French was strangled to death.
Chance to exonerate herself almost to a degree by saving the life of this young girl, and she didn't do it.
On May 15th, 1992, police across southern Ontario mobilized to form the Green Ribbon Task Force to solve both murders.
People of St. Catharines wanted this killer caught, and the police were working on it full time, and they were spending a lot of time working on it. They just weren't coming up with anything. Paul was careful. He was being careful.
The task force fields an influx of information concerning the homicides. One man comes forward, suggesting his friend, Paul Bernardo, may be involved.
That friend just believed that he was responsible, that he thought that he was a Scarborough rapist, and that he was violent towards women.
Investigators pay a visit to Paul Bernardo. He's calm, cool, and even admits to being questioned in the Scarborough rape case. Investigators confirm that he was one of hundreds interviewed, and the DNA is still being processed.
And he certainly doesn't fit the stereotype that people believe. A very good-looking young man, sitting there with a nice home here in St. Catharines, with a wife that was at work. There was nothing there to lead us, and certainly nothing in his past, no criminal record or anything that would lead us to look at him any stronger than we looked at any of our other suspects or people of interest at the time.
One more piece of information in Paul's favor is that he doesn't drive the type of car witnesses saw leaving the scene of Kristen's abduction.
Paul was beside himself with amusement. You know, he was making comments about the incompetent cops. They can't even, you know, they don't even have the right car.
Paul feels invincible and turns on Karla, completing the 5 steps.
She's doing absolutely everything that he's asked her to do. He says to himself, no decent woman would engage in those type of behaviors, so I was right. All women are bitches, whores, and sluts. And so step number 5 is punishment.
A year and a half after their Niagara Falls wedding, the marriage of Paul and Karla Bernardo implodes.
He beat Karla so bad that she had 2 raccoon eyes from battering with a flashlight that she left him, and that was the beginning of the end.
On January 4th, 1993, Karla's mother convinces her to leave Paul and press charges against him for assault. As she packs, Karla searches frantically for the incriminating videotapes of the sexual assaults of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. But she doesn't find them. While Karla hides from Paul at a relative's house in Brampton, an hour north, Niagara police arrest Paul on January 6, 1993, for assaulting Karla with a deadly weapon, but release him the following day on his own recognizance. 3 weeks later, the Green Ribbon Task Force gets a break in the case.
We had spoken to Toronto about Paul Bernardo several times, and there was nothing that connected him to the Scarborough rapes or him to our murders. Then Toronto did a DNA check on Paul, and it did identify Paul as the Scarborough rapist.
The task force sets up surveillance of Paul, while the Scarborough rape investigators obtain necessary warrants and solidify their case.
We had no evidence at that time, but the connection was there, it was strong. They were having their rapes in the Toronto area. Then he moved down to our area, and now we have homicides. And it was just a matter of getting the evidence to prove it.
Police interview Karla, hoping she will incriminate Paul in the murder.
Came to her, she thought to talk about the domestic violence charge, but then they began asking questions about the rapes.
She is defensive and uncooperative and asks for a lawyer. Karla's lawyer calls the Toronto prosecutor to discuss a deal on February 14th.
What appears to have happened is a what-if conversation. What if I was to deliver you a witness to the homicides, and what if that person was involved but not directly involved, and so on and so forth? What could you do for me and my client? In the meantime, he also sent Karla to see a psychologist and a psychiatrist. And they bought into this whole thing about her being a compliant victim. And they produced a report. So armed with the report, they negotiated the deal. And part of the deal was that she would be, as the Americans would call it, a queen for a day. She would have a without prejudice meeting with the police and give her a sample of what she knew.
Karla tells police that Paul murdered Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French after raping them for several days. She says there are videotapes to prove it.
She was laying all the fault on Paul, her husband, as being the one responsible, and that she was just going along doing exactly what he wanted done so that she didn't get beaten or had any more harm coming to her as well.
She was the only other witness to the crimes, to the murders, and so they felt they needed her as a witness. They didn't quite fully understand her role, I guess, and so she signed a deal.
In February of 1993, police arrest Paul Bernardo for the Scarborough rapes and the 2 homicides.
But they didn't charge him with the homicides because they didn't have enough. They had nothing to link him to the crime other than Karla's Queen for a Day statement.
Step back, please.
They brought him into the task force office, and they had a life-size image of Leslie Mahaffey and a life-size image of Kristen French.
Gentlemen, this door open. Stay outside the door.
And they thought they would shock him into confessing. And they sat him down in front of the camera, and he kept saying, I just want to speak to my lawyer. When do I get to speak to my lawyer? I have nothing to say. Thank you very much.
They search Bernardo's home for 71 days. They find several suspicious items, but nothing linking Paul directly to the murders of Leslie and Kristen. On May 17th, Karla shows police around the house and points out where Paul held the girls captive. The bedroom where he raped and tortured them. A hallway closet where Kristen was locked up. The basement where Paul dismembered Leslie Mahaffey and encased her body parts in cement. Police find DNA evidence proving Kristen and Leslie were inside the house. The next day, Bernardo was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In exchange for her testimony against Paul, Karla pleads guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in July of 1993. She receives a 10-year sentence.
And she remembered that she had not told them about her sister Tammy Homolka. And she tells them the story. And as a result of that, they amend the agreement. So essentially, it's 5 for Leslie, 5 for Kristen, and 2 for Tammy. That's how the deal was made. That's how you get 12 years.
The deal was absolutely stunk. I mean, the deal with the devil, they called it. And she should have got life in jail. And she got 12 years.
"16 months after the deal, John Rosen takes over as Paul Bernardo's counsel and finds out what happened to the infamous videotapes. Paul hid them inside a light fixture in the bathroom. They had been missing for months.
The tapes depicted Bernardo and Homolka out playing voyeur, taking pictures through windows of people getting undressed and so forth. They depicted the sexual assault and confirmed the unlawful confinement of Leslie Mahaffey, who was blindfolded. They confirmed the unlawful confinement and sexual assault of Kristen French. They portrayed the sexual assault on Tammy Homolka and the participation of both Karla Homolka and Bernardo.
The tapes are played during Paul's trial. There is a public outcry as the tapes reveal Karla's true involvement.
Karla is as much or more a psychopath than is Paul. And I think the videotapes show that she was engaged, happily engaged in sexually assaulting and in fact, in her own way, raping these young girls as much as Paul was. So this is someone that's pretty profoundly pathological.
Her explanation was that she was just play acting for the videotapes, but that off-camera life was hell. But the problem was that off-camera, she still didn't do normal things, like walk out, go to the police, leave.
Paul admits to the rapes, but denies killing Leslie and Kristen.
He was prepared to let Leslie Mahaffey go because she had been blindfolded and didn't know where she was. And in terms of Kristen French, he left Karla alone with her. He came back and he found her dead.
Got up in the stand, and he was very cocky, and like he was going to explain how Karla had did it and how he didn't do it. He looked over at the jury partway through, and he realized he wasn't bullshitting anybody. They all hated him.
On September 1st, 1995, 8 years after committing his first rape, a jury convicts Paul Bernardo of the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French and sentences him to life in prison. On November 23, 1995, Paul pleads guilty to all rape charges and manslaughter in Tammy Homolka's death. He is declared a dangerous offender, and he will most likely never be released from prison. In 2001, after Paul Bernardo exhausts all his appeals, the videotapes are destroyed. On July 4, 2005, Karla Homolka is released from prison after serving her entire sentence.
She's living life. She has a baby. Neither Tammy nor Kristen French nor Leslie Mahaffey will ever have that opportunity. And I think it's, in my opinion, a miscarriage of justice.
To this day, Karla's role in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French remains a mystery.
People want to blame Karla, and that's fine. But what they forget is that Paul Bernardo was extremely violent. I know there's no question in my mind who was the instigator. Does that minimize what Karla did? Absolutely not.
Neither could have committed the homicides alone, but together they formed an entity that was greater than the sum of the individual parts.
Not much doubt in my mind that he was the killer and she was just the facilitator in this whole sordid, evil, twisted scheme of theirs.
Years later, the Bernardo's house on Bayview Drive is torn down.
I'll never forget this corner. Like, they can change the names, do whatever they want, but for the people that are here, it's unforgettable.